Hi, my name is Nikki Giamarco, and I'm a librarian in the Community Engagement and Outreach Office of Pima County Public Library. I'm a member of our library's Biblio Lotus team, whose mission is to support and value the culture and voice of our Asian communities in Pima County by providing resources and programs and by establishing ongoing partnerships with Asian organizations. The Biblio Lotus team was started to fill a service gap within the library system by serving the Asian communities in Pima County. And it's important for us to not only celebrate Asian culture, but we also want to highlight the voices of our Asian community within Pima County. I'm with Dr. Howard J. Ng to discuss his recently published book, Pursuing the American Dream, Tucson Chinese-Owned Grocery Stores. And Dr. Ng is a native Tucsonan. He is Associate Professor Emeritus, retired in the University of Arizona, Mellon Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health, and our Ken Quay College of Pharmacy. Dr. Ng received his BS in Zoology and Pharmacy and MS in Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of Arizona. Later, he received his doctor in public health at the University of Texas School of Public Health. Dr. Ng is a licensed pharmacist for 50 years in Arizona. He has 45 plus years of experience working in healthcare. Dr. Ng has been a health services and policy researcher for 29 years. He has 23 years of experience working in rural Arizona and 21 years of working on the US-Mexico border. Dr. Ng is a local historian in the Tucson Chinese community. Hi, Dr. Ng, or Howard, welcome. I'm so excited to be speaking with you about this book and how it sheds light on a lot of history a lot of us don't know. It is so interesting to read all the different accounts, history, and memories of various Chinese grocery stores here in Tucson and Pima County and throughout Southern Arizona. Can you give us some background information about your interest in writing the book? How did it come to fruition? And what was your research process like?
Well, the idea or the thought about writing a book occurred in the early 90s. In the early 90s, I realized that my generation of the kids from my generation have no concept of the history of the Chinese community in Tucson. This is also true of those who are new residents who are of Chinese descent in Tucson, did not have any idea of the history of the Tucson Chinese. And that fostered the idea of writing a book describing the Chinese in Tucson. In terms of the research, I think I have to go with starting with the idea of writing a book. And what do I want to have in the book? And what do I want to be able to talk about? So part of writing the book was the idea of providing a historical background of who are the Chinese people in Tucson, when did they come, what were some of the challenges, what did they do, and then I wanted to write about or talk about the Chinese community in general. That included the two Chinatowns that were in Tucson. At the time of writing the book, I didn't realize there was two Chinatowns. As you mentioned earlier, I'm a native Tucsonian. I grew up in Tucson, but never paid attention to the Chinatowns. And so part of the discovery of doing the research, I learned about the two Chinatowns. I also wanted to talk about the Chinese community in terms of some of the Chinese associations, organizations that had an impact on the Chinese community, primarily support the Chinese community. From the grocery store owner and family point of view, those associations that provided financial support, social support, welfare support, a place of belonging. So I decided I wanted to pursue those organizations specifically. Then I wanted to talk about the Chinese grocery store in terms of the rise and fall and be able to find information that would provide me that kind of information. And I found the city of Tucson city directories was an ideal source of information because it does list all the grocery stores in Tucson, at least most of them. That's one of the limitation of the data. And it gave me opportunity to identify which of those stores were owned by Chinese persons. I also wanted the book to be able to uh, provide background, provide a source of context of what was it like growing up in a grocery store. What was the benefit of growing up in a grocery store? Why did the owners of Chinese people decided to go into the grocery store business? And those are, I asked for individuals, those who will write stories about their experience. And there's 88 stories in the book to give you an insight in terms of what it was like. I also wanted to provide a listing of the grocery stores I was able to identify from 1881 to 1991, which is 110 years, in which I was able to identify 282 of those. So that's generally the process.
That's a lot. Um, that's certainly a big endeavor. I personally was not aware of the history of Chinese immigration to this area. It wasn't until I started working for the library and I was looking for some information to put together a book display. I certainly didn't realize there was a Chinatown, and just asking random coworkers who've lived here all their lives, they hadn't heard of that either. So I feel like you're uncovering a little bit of history that is very, very obscure. Um, what do you think makes this history of Chinese in the Southwest and in Pima County and Tucson, um, and maybe in US texts altogether, so obscure and hard to find?
Well, I think that when one talks about the Chinese community in the United States, one think about the big Chinatowns, San Francisco, LA, New York City. And the first thing that comes to most people's mind is when you're talking about Chinese people, you think about those areas. And so there is a natural interest in those communities, especially those with the large Chinatowns, as well as those with large Chinese populations. In Arizona is a state one doesn't think there would be too many Chinese people, which in looking at the total population, let's say in Pima County, we have about 1 million people, but there's roughly about 10,000 Chinese people in Pima County. So one really doesn't think about those type of things. And but this is also true of other parts of the country. I mean, the story about Chinese grocery store owned is not unusual. They occur in California, they occur in Texas, they occur uh, in Mississippi. So wherever there is a fair number of Chinese grocery store, the stories are basically the same. So it's a very universal story that's being told.
That is interesting. Then seems common for many early immigrants that have come to the country of a variety of different cultures. It seems that grocery store and restaurant ownership are often a business that new immigrants are able to start more easily. Um, I was curious what your thoughts were on the impact that the elimination of the Tucson Chinatowns, because they were in downtown twice, right? There was the early 1900s and then elimination of a Chinatown to make way for the Tucson City Hall. And then again, closer to the mid 1900s, Tucson Chinatown again was eliminated. Um, what what was the impact of the elimination of Tucson Chinatown in both instances on the local Chinese community?
Well, I think, first of all, I think I need to define what Chinatown is, because depending on who the researcher are, there may be different definition of Chinatown. My definition of Chinatown is a large number of Chinese businesses and residents in a particular area. In other words, there's a reasonable concentration of Chinese people. For the Chinatown, it was a place for immigrants to be able to practice the traditions, the culture, be able to speak Chinese, be able to buy Chinese goods, herbs, and other things, and a place where they can socialize, and a place to get away from discrimination. So that's my definition of Chinatown. That definition also fits the two Chinatowns. When the Chinese first came to Tucson in the mid 1870s, they settled north of Pennington. The area of north of Pennington that included, on the north is Alameda, in the south is Pennington, on the uh, on the east is Meyer Street, and then it crosses over the river, and then there was some Chinese shanty, which is the poor part of Chinatown. So that area was the first Chinatown that includes Main Street, Ott, Pearl, Alameda. Those were the major streets. When the Women's Club decided to build a new office building, they decided to take part of Chinatown. Then a few years later, then the city of Tucson decided they want to build a city building, and that took the other part of Chinatown. So in 1911, the Chi Kung Tong bought property further south of that covered the area from Nether to Maine to Meyer, brought a little bit over a square block. And that was the primary part of Chinatown. That also included a couple of stores and a laundry. So the boundary of the second Chinatown was Messina, Meyer, Maine, and Nether. That boundary, because there was a second Chinatown, it was not affected by the uh, destruction of the first one. So the second one carried on. But it was a small Chinatown. It was only maybe about 3 or 4 blocks. Now, when urban renewal came, which was in the late 60s, they decided they wanted that whole area of Barrio Viejo, the northern part of that. And so they took that whole area of Chinatown. They also took a number of grocery stores that was also in that area. So in terms of the impact of the Chinese community, meanwhile, as there was a small Chinatown, there was also Chinese community center that was there. and also many Chinese associations, organizations that was able to meet the needs of the Chinese people. So the impact of losing Chinatown for the community was not that great. The impact on the immigrants, on the other hand, having the place that I mentioned earlier, a place where they can practice traditions and so forth, so on, they can still do it in other forms, but it's not the same as having a Chinatown.
Yeah, just that safe space in a concentrated area
Yes.
is nice. Um, I found it really interesting to learn that so many of the store owners learn to speak Spanish or learn to speak different indigenous languages to communicate better with their customers. And that a lot of the memories that were recounted in the book um, included sort of these stories of generosity. Store owners extended credit, helped impoverished customers who were hungry or had needs. And that it's interesting to see that Chinese grocery store owners were very, very much supportive of helping their community out. What impact did this intersectionality with the indigenous and with the Hispanic um, and the Chinese communities all together have um, on the Pima County community itself?
Well, I think that, first of all, in the early days of Tucson, the Chinese grocery store was just about in every single neighborhood. So it was part of the neighborhood. It wasn't uh, like some of the large box stores we have now. They're part of the neighborhood, but they're not part of the neighborhood. While in the Chinese grocery store, you really had a place where people would go for gathering. They would go talk about the news, politics, what's happening in sports, and so forth. In the summertime, wintertime, it was a place to get away from the cold or the heat because it was one of the few places that's air conditioned or had heating.
Yeah,
It also provided for the community the interaction. Many of the neighbors became friends of the grocers and the family. Many of the kids grew up with the neighborhood kids. They went to school together. They basically grew up together. So there was a very rich environment of interaction of culture. Um, in terms of the Chinese, the interaction occurred with the Mexican population. It occurred with the African American population, the Native American population, um, the white Anglo population, and others, because the neighborhoods were very close together. They were self-contained communities within Tucson. So there was a lot of rich interaction that occurred.
that's very cool. Um, it's one of the things I like about Tucson now. Is it feels that diversity is sprinkled throughout the city and county as opposed to segregated pockets that I've seen in other cities. Um, Earlier, you referred to kind of like the rise and fall of the uh, Chinese owned grocery stores. And in your book, it mentions that many Chinese grocery store owners didn't want their children to take over the store business and wanted them instead to pursue higher education. Um, it's the immigrant parents' story and legacy to their kids, I feel, as common to many immigrant parents who want their kids to have a different life and not have to struggle the way that they did. I feel like this is often an overlooked aspect of immigrant labor, but what do you feel were the benefits of that to the Pima County economy? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Yes, it does. I mean,
Okay.
you have to remember that the Chinese-owned grocery store provided a means for the American dream to happen. Every generation, every new immigrant generation, wants to have life better for the next generation. And the Chinese grocery store provided that platform to do that. In terms from an economic standpoint, the impact it's had on the Tucson community and Pima County is that one, it was able to provide a place where families can get credit. In the early days of Tucson, individuals only got paid once a month, or if they're lucky, maybe twice a month. And they needed to have a means to be able to stretch their um, money to buy food over that period of time between paychecks. So the Chinese grocery store provided that opportunity to do so. In the early days of Tucson, many people did not trust banks. So they wouldn't go and cash their checks at banks. And so the Chinese grocery store provided basically an informal banking system. From an economic standpoint, because the Chinese grocery stores were plentiful at an early part of the turn of the 1900s. From 1902 to 1920, there were more Chinese-owned grocery stores than not. So that provided, and those numbers increased until 1955, which there was 119 Chinese-owned grocery stores in Tucson. That provided a means for wholesalers of different types to survive. So the Chinese grocery stores was one of their primary customers to many of these wholesalers. It's, supported, wholesalers like milk companies, bread companies, meat companies, uh, wholesalers in general. In addition to that, the Chinese also provided a significant amount of tax money, both property taxes and sales taxes. So from an economic standpoint, in addition to providing an economic base for the Chinese people, it also provided a, economic support for the Tucson community as a whole.
I think about also the work ethic and experience conveyed to a lot of the young people who worked in the stores while they went to school and then went off to college to become pharmacists, for example, or went to work at Raytheon or other places, but had already a very hearty work ethic from helping out in the family stores. Um, I don't know if I'm incorrect in thinking that is also kind of an interesting byproduct of the grocery stores in the area, but I don't know
Yes.
if you have any. Yeah.
Well, basically, there was a lot of things that were learned about working in a grocery store. You learn to interact with people. You learn to get along with people. You also learn to tolerate certain people. Um, it's also a place to learn about responsibility. Because one of the things about uh, if you had a large enough grocery store, the kids had to work. You work after school. You work on weekends. You work on summer breaks. Um, you really didn't have much of a break as a kid. You were part of the workforce for the store. But you also learn how hard it is to earn a dollar. You also learn that there are times of good times in terms of money coming in and tough times coming in. You learn about business skills, some business skills. So there are other benefits of growing up in a grocery store.
Yeah, for sure. Um, that's a great segue into my next question, which is about your memories. You related um, the um, the Chinese grocery trucks, and that you like to climb on top of the ice box of your family's grocery truck to get the ice to eat. What other memories do you have that took place with the grocery truck or with the Right Way Market that you worked in? I think you worked there for 3 years.
Uh, Actually, let's see, my parents had two grocery trucks,
Mm.
and they were on the road in selling groceries in rural Arizona. So I remember some of those trips to some of the customers that were in on reservation. My parents went as far as Eloy to sell groceries and in between. So I remember those trips and the beautiful scenery in those days. In terms of Right Way Market, my parents owned that store for 27 years until they retired. I guess my fondest memories is the fun time I had with the neighborhood kids. We have a dirt lot that was behind the store, and that was our baseball field. Um, in the summertime, we used to have water fights. So I also remember the time since Right Way Market is across the street from the rodeo grounds. And in addition to the rodeo, it was also the old fairgrounds. So the fairgrounds, every year the fair will be right across the street, and you can just go walk right across the street and you can go to the fair. So those
Wow.
are some of my fond memories.
Oh, that's amazing. I was going to ask if it was really hard in the dead of summer, if you were helping out or riding along to Eloy. But I think summers for Tucsonans just becomes sort of like a badge of honor.
Well, luckily for many of us, well, in terms of those days going on the truck, I don't remember too much of that, but I know that if it's like now, the summers are very, very hot.
Mm.
And, we always tell those who are outside of Tucson that it's dry heat. That's not the real secret. The secret is everything is air conditioned.
Yeah.
Cars are air conditioned, houses are air conditioned, stores are air conditioned, malls are air conditioned. So, but one of the good things about Tucson is our summer doesn't last that long. Our winters are basically very mild, and most of the time in between, the weather is great.
Yeah, that is very true. Um, Howard, what do you hope people will um, gain from reading your book?
Well, I hope that those who read the book will gain an understanding of the history of the Chinese in Tucson, what the Chinese did in the early days and how it evolved over time. Um, Also would like the those who read the book understand how the Chinese grocery store provided the foundation for many Chinese people to live the American dream. And for those who see many of us who are in professions, in managerial roles and other type of occupations is to know where we came from. It was a
Yeah.
result of our parents, grandparents, in terms of their struggle, long hours in the grocery store to provide us that opportunity.
Yeah. Speaking of labor and labors of love, you put a lot into this book. What advice would you give to anyone who's thinking of or aspiring to write a nonfiction, um, maybe historically based book, um, who wants to maybe chronicle a community's history, a community that might have very little information out there about it? What advice would you impart to them?
Well, I think the first question is, what part of history do you want to tell?
Mm.
Uh, in terms of what do you want to say or what do you want to convey? I think it's important to know what your question's going to be. If you don't know what your question is, in other words, um, if you want to talk about, let's say, uh, the history of the Chinese in terms of the restaurants, you need to know, for example, what does that mean? You know, do you want to talk about what is it like owning, working, benefiting from a restaurant? Or do you want to just share that experience? Then you want to decide on how deep you want to go into the history, how precise you want to be in the history. If you want to go very precise, then you have to go with reliable sources of information, like the Tucson Library, the Arizona Historical Society, um, the uh, the websites, books, etc. And then you got to be really patient because there's going to be times that you're going to run into dead ends. And you have to make sure that the information you convey from a historical perspective that is as accurate as you can get it, because other people will use that information to build on their research.
A good point. Um, in a discussion you and I had earlier, you mentioned triangulation um, and ensuring that you're getting multiple sources of information. Do you mind expanding on that thought as well?
Well, let me give you an example of triangulation in terms of let me give about 2 or 3 examples. One example is the idea of Chinatown. I started out with just looking at what's been written about Chinatown in Tucson. And I also went in a different direction and start looking at documentation through maps. One of the things about the Sanborn fire insurance maps is it identifies the Chinese areas in Tucson in the early days. So if you wanted to see where the Chinese lived, businesses or residents, it's on the map. So you take the map and you take what's written and it gives you an idea. And then you also take a look at what other information that's out there and triangulate to make sure your conclusion is fairly accurate or fairly consistent. That's one example. I grew up looking at knowing that the convenience stores had a great impact on the Chinese grocery store. Okay. I saw it in person. But the data that I was able to summarize from the city directory was able to actually provide me numbers, the number of Circle Ks, number of 7-Elevens, number of U-Totems, number of Quick Mart. So in 1960, there was only 4 convenience stores in Tucson. In 1991, there was 155. So I took what I knew and actually had data to support it. And that's what, is important in terms of how you present your information. So people know that what you're saying is fairly reliable and fairly consistent.
Yes. And data tells a story in and of itself too, right? So we learn
Yes.
a lot about the narrative from the data. Um, my last question for you, as a lifelong Tucsonan, what is your favorite aspect of living here?
I think in some ways, I think Tucson still has that small town feeling. I mean, even though in Pima County we have over 1 million people and things have changed over time, but in general, people are still very friendly. And part of that friendliness is that small town atmosphere. And I think that's one of the best things about Tucson.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing information about your research and process and thoughts about the history of the Chinese in Pima County and Tucson. And we're looking forward to the author talk that will occur on August 13th at 3 p.m. at Martha Cooper Library. And I just want to say thank you again for sharing this information and this important history with us.
And thank you for your invitation.